So today I'm going to tell a few stories of saints and then draw some lessons from these stories. And I'm looking forward to hearing your insights and feedback at the end of all of this. And then perhaps, given time, you might also share some of your favorite saints and perhaps. So to start, I want to tell the story of a war. This is the Orthodox Peace Fellowship. So I want to talk about saints of war and peace. This is a war that you may or may not be familiar with that occurred in the Middle East between two great powers. It was an intractable conflict that never quite resolved, lost many lives, and was inflected by terrorism and justified by religious fervor, saying this was, of course, a holy mission. And of course, I'm talking about the Byzantine Sassanid War of 420. So for those of you not familiar with this great conflict, let me provide a little historical context. And we'll get into the saints who lived through this war. So this war occurred between the Byzantine or Roman and Persian empires. Most of the fighting was near what is today the Turkish-Syrian border. And Rome and Persia have had wars for a very, very long time. The earliest legacy or originator of this war happened back in the 5th century before the Common Era, so 500 years before Christ, when the Persians conquered a very small colony that was then known as Byzantion, which of course gives us the name Byzantine. But the conflict itself properly started in Mark Antony in 54 before the Common Era. And since then, there had been frequent and, a war that kind of starts and stops. These were two powers that always kind of rivaled. So either when they weren't actively fighting, they were having a Cold War, so to speak. Now, the critical context for the War of 420, I need to take you back to the previous century. So in the 380s, there was a peace treaty that was signed between these two powers, which divided up Armenia between them. This peace treaty led to an era of good relations between them. And it was signed, shortly after it was signed, the emperor of Persia who signed it, whose name was Shapur, and I apologize, I'm going to get all these names terribly wrong. Shapur died, and that was left some unsteadiness in the region. Now, one thing to know about Shapur leading up to this is his father lived during the Christianization of the Roman Empire. So we all know the story of Constantine and the Edict of Milan, and then the following Christianization of the Roman Empire. And in response to this, there was a kind of arms race of religion that happened. So when Rome adopted Christianity as their primary religion, Persia decided to Zoroastrianize their nation. So the Avesta was compiled during this period. So what you had was a ratcheting up of religious identity and connection of religious identity with political identity. And what happened is, over time, as you do this, as one can imagine, connecting religious identity and political identity, the tensions start to rise. So originally, Christians in Persia were not viewed as foreign elements. But with time, they came to be identified with Romans. And if you were a Christian in Persia, then you were seen as a Roman in Persia. So one thing that happened during this period, during the 4th century, is when the war broke out again in the 330s, Shapur's father started to tax the Christians at a higher rate, so double the rate of a normal tax. And this brings us to our first saint that I want to mention, which is Shimon bar Sabe, now known as Saint Shimon. And Saint Shimon thought that this tax was unjust, so he engaged in one of the world's first campaigns of nonviolent resistance, where they refused to cooperate with the Persian authorities, refused to pay the tax, and did not take up violence to oppose this war, but instead, when they were captured, willingly went to their execution, which is a kind of very classic Christian response to political authority at the time. So our first saint here is someone who engaged in nonviolent war resistance. And so hopefully you can see some of the analogies to today. But as I said, Shapur died in certainly after the peace treaty that was signed, and tensions started to ratchet up, and his son Yazdegerd became king of the Persian Empire. When this happened, the Roman emperor decided to send a peace delegation to the Persian court and to try to reestablish diplomatic ties. Now that the old king was dead, you want to secure the treaty, so you sent out this. And according to Socrates Scholasticus, one of the people that they sent was the bishop of Mafrikant, named Maruthus, now Saint Maruthus. Maruthus, if you're probably not familiar with him, was a very, very learned man. He was a close friend of John Chrysostom. Chrysostom, talked about how great Maruthus was in his letters. Maruthus attended the Second Ecumenical Council. He translated the Council of Nicaea into Syriac. And if you look at the Syriac translation, there's a bunch of extra canons that are sometimes seen as authoritative. And scholars think that Maruthus himself wrote that. So a very influential person in the history of the church. He was also a doctor, a physician, and evidently took his medical care as an extension of his Christian work, that Christians are supposed to minister to people who are sick. And it's possible that he operated his own free hospital. So anyone who's in need, without somewhere to stay, without medical care, you could come and he would give you free health care, take care of you, and pay for himself. So some sources say that Maruthus was sent solely to negotiate as a diplomat, and others say that he was sent first and foremost as a physician. In either case, there's a story that circulated that Yazdegerd's son, so the new Persian emperor's son, had some kind of disorder, something wrong with his head. Sources call it a violent headache, whatever that means, as well as possibly, seizures. And reportedly, Maruthus went there, worked as a physician in the Persian court, and cured Yazdegerd's son. And from this, as you can imagine, opened up a great deal of good feeling between Maruthus and the new king. So a lot of these historical sources say that Maruthus treating Yazdegerd's son is what restabilized relations, helped the peace treaty kind of be resecured. So he worked both as an ambassador and as a physician. This era led to more religious freedom for Christians in Persia. Yazdegerd was actually had some court intrigue where he was accused of being closer to the Christians than he was to the Magi, the Zoroastrian priests. And it's possibly those Magi who, for this reason, assassinated Yazdegerd in 420. So this would make a great spy novel, perhaps. There's one story that Emperor Arcadius, who was the Byzantine Roman emperor, chose Yazdegerd rather than any family member or any Roman to be the guardian for his young son, Theodosius II. So Arcadius had a son, Theodosius II. We'll hear more about him in a second. And Arcadius was really worried that his son Theodosius would be, whoever the guardian was appointed, would try to usurp power in the Roman Empire and try to control, because if, let's say, Arcadius dies, then Theodosius is suddenly the new king. And if he's a young boy, then as one knows, whoever the tutor is, or whoever the guardian is de facto the new king. So because Maruthus had built this bridge of peace, Arcadius reportedly sent his son to Persia to learn under Yazdegerd. So what greater kind of integration of peace you could have than having your son raised by the former enemy king? Now, my own opinion is that historically this is probably not true, based on some of the timeline doesn't quite match up. But that's reportedly, what Procopius said. So just to summarize, I know I'm giving you a lot of historical details now, which isn't that exciting. We've had a long-standing war that turned to peace by the actions of a bishop and led to this era of integration. However, it's all going to break down soon. So the first thing that happens is Arcadius, in fact, does die, leaving his son Theodosius the new king at 7 years old. Now, whether or not he was in Persia at this time, he obviously came back, and the person who then started to rule in his stead was his sister Pulcheria, known as the Empress Pulcheria. I think she was 15 years old at the time. So just like Arcadius predicted, she became the de facto ruler of the Roman Empire. And unlike her brother, didn't have as much experience with the Persians. Another detail I should mention that happened at this time was if it's true that Theodosius II was under the tutelage of Yazdegerd during this period, then we can be confident that Saint Maruthus was involved in his education, because we know he went back to Persia on a second peace mission during this time period. And his primary goal here was to collect the relics, basically the remains of Christians who had been killed in Persia during the previous century. And as you can imagine, this would be a very difficult request to make, because it's basically saying to the Persian king, remember all those Christians that you and your fathers have killed and executed? I want to dig up all of their graves and collect their bones and have this big procession celebrating them, executed by the state, and then take them back to Rome and build giant monuments to them. And people will always remember, these Romans who were killed by Persians. And you can imagine that this wouldn't make the Persians look very good, especially in the eyes of Christians. So this would be a hard ask. But Maruthus, such a great diplomat, was able to get it through. So he got permission and built a city that came to be known as Martyropolis, where they celebrated these martyrs. I find that event really interesting, because when we think about warfare, we often think about trauma, and there's a real question after a war, how you remember it. And that's, I think, one of the most important questions that we think about learning from the saints here, where learning from the saints means remembering them. And the question of memory, on the one hand, can inspire us, can move us forward, push us towards, learn about Maruthus and say, here's a peacemaker, let's do this. On the other hand, one can imagine how this might escalate tensions if we think, these are our martyrs and you killed them, therefore we hate you. It appears that during Maruthus's life, it was more the former than the latter. Relations between Persians and Christians actually cooled during this period. So in 408 to 4010 was Maruthus's second embassy to Persia. And at the end of that, alongside securing Martyropolis, he also got Persia to issue in 410 an edict of religious freedom, which has been called the Edict of Milan of the East. So allowing Christians to freely worship in Zoroastrian territory. So a really impressive guy. The last story, or the last person I'm going to mention here before we get to the calamity, the actual war, is Acacius, Bishop of Amida, who was a friend of Maruthus and was also sent as a diplomat during 418 to 419. So this was during the peacetime, though tensions were starting to escalate. Acacius, under Maruthus's tutelage, went to Persia and acquainted himself with Persians, found sympathy for them, and learned to make peace. So that's where everything leading up to the year 420. You had personal peace missions between Maruthus and Yezdegerd. You had a couple of kings dying, Arcadius dying, Theodosius taking over. You had some cooling of relations, but you also had this project of historical memory. And things got really terrible in 420 for a couple of reasons. The first two things that happened is Maruthus died and Yazdegerd died. So the king who was soft on Christians was supposedly assassinated, and the Roman who went there to make peace died of natural causes. So without these two peacemakers there, there was not a lot to secure continuing peace. The second thing that happened is that the bishop of Ctesiphon, named Abdus, who we now know as Saint Abdus, reportedly led a group of Christian priests and monks to a fire temple, a Zoroastrian fire temple, and they burnt the temple to the ground. This is an act of terrorism. They went to a religious institution and basically bombed it. There are some reports which say it wasn't Abdus himself who lit the fire, but he was maybe present there. So Abdus's direct role is maybe a little in question, but he clearly seemed to have taken responsibility for it. So what happened is, this is right before Yazdegerd died. So right before Yazdegerd died, we had this incident, which became, the terroristic spark that led to the war. So Yazdegerd needed to appear hard on the Christians, so he called Abdus and his followers to the court and said to him, quote, "Since you are the chief and leader of these men, why do you allow them to despise our kingdom, to transgress our command, and act according to their own will? You demolish and destroy our houses of worship and foundations of our fire temple." And Abdus apparently stayed silent at this. And another priest shouted back, "I demolish the foundation and extinguish the fire because it is not a house of God, nor is the fire a daughter of God." So as you can imagine, a king being provoked like this might want to lash out. But instead of ordering their execution, Yazdegerd simply said, "Okay, look, just pay us for the damages, pay us to rebuild the temple, and we'll let this go." And Abdus said, "There is no way that I'm going to give money to build a Zoroastrian temple." So he refused. And with that, Abdus the terrorist became Saint Abdus the martyr when he was executed by Yazdegerd. And then shortly after, Yazdegerd was assassinated and the war broke out. Yazdegerd's son was Bahram V, and he did not like Christians. This led to basically a breakdown of relations here. So we have, so far, the replacement of Saint Maruthus, the peacemaker, with Saint Abdus, the terrorist, with the religious undergirding of it. And you can see how this starts to inflect their politics. So there was a Zoroastrian priest who went to Bahram and said, um, pointing towards this incident with Abdus, quote, "All Christians have rebelled against you. They no longer do your will. They despise your orders. They refuse to worship your gods. If the king would hear me, let him give orders that the Christians convert from their religion. For they hold the same faith as Romans and are entire agreement together. Should a wars interpose between the two empires, these Christians will be a thorn in your side." So the priest is saying Christians are Romans, despite being Persian citizens. So we Persians have to kill them. So they were gearing up for a holy war. Now, let's go to Byzantium. In Byzantium, some of you may know there's really not a tradition of holy war or of a just war theory. And throughout most of the Byzantine wars in history, they viewed them as things that were not to be celebrated, things that were bad. This holds true for basically every Byzantine war, except for the 420 war that we're talking about here. Kenneth Holm is a historian, and he calls this Pulcheria's Crusade. This is one war waged by the Byzantine Empire where language of crusading or of holy war is most appropriate. According to the historian Sozomen, the troops were sent with religious fervor, quote, "ready to do anything for the sake of Christianity." And Pulcheria, who again is the new guardian of her brother Theodosius the Emperor, leaned into this. So Pulcheria dedicated herself as a religious virgin. She was patterning herself after Mary, the Theotokos. And her religious vows were peculiar because she was a non-monastic and lived a public life. So in this way, it kind of was more similar to a Vestal virgin than a Christian ascetic. There's lots of questions about, historians debate, why did she do this? What was her inspiration? There are some who suggest that there was a political angle to this, that, as a virgin, she wouldn't have to have a husband and she wouldn't have to worry about heirs or other people taking away her power. And then, of course, in the church, we remember this for a purely religious significance, because she did, in fact, do a lot of great things, turning the palace reportedly into a kind of monastery. And she did a lot of charitable activities, etc. It formed groups of women to come and pray. But in the popular mind, she was reviewed as this kind of lightning rod of religious fervor, an example of a great holy leader who was doing, embodying the virtues of the Byzantine state. There's Kenneth Holm, one of the historians, points to evidence in the coinage where they suddenly started minting a bunch of coins with Nike, the goddess of victory, during this period. And he makes the argument that there's a connection here between the goddess Nike and the victory motif of, the kind of women warrior, a female warrior with Pulcheria's place. But whatever Pulcheria was thinking, she wanted to go to war here. And this led to, a bloody battle, and I'll skip all of the details of what actually happened in the war. But what I will mention is that there's a hagiography that records that at some point near the end of the war, there were 7,000 Persian prisoners of war who were held in the city of Amida, which is where Acacius, Maruthus's mentee, was the bishop. So even though Maruthus had died, his protege Acacius was still around. And Acacius, remember, had went to Persia, had consorted with Yazdegerd, had grown sympathy. And so when he was sitting there as bishop, watching these 7,000 men being held, being captured, starving in these prison of war camps. He was moved with compassion. So Acacius gathered his clergy and reportedly said, quote, "Our God, my brethren needs neither dishes nor cups, for he neither eats nor drinks, nor is he want in anything. Since then, since then, by the liberality of its faithful members, the church possesses many vessels of both gold and silver. It behooves us to sell them, and by the money thus raised, we may be able to redeem the prisoners and provide them with food." So Socrates Scholasticus continues, "Having said these things and many others similar to these, Acacius ordered the vessels to be melted down, and from the proceeds paid the soldiers a ransom for their captives, whom he supported for some time, and then furnishing them with what was needful for their journey, sent them back to their sovereign. This benevolence on the part of the excellent Acacius astonished the king of the Persians, as if the Romans were accustomed to conquer their enemies as well by their beneficence in peace as by their prowess in war. They also say that the Persian king wished that Acacius should come into his presence, that he might have the pleasure of beholding such a man, a wish that the Emperor Theodosius soon granted." So Acacius says, look, the church doesn't need all this gold and silver. God doesn't require such things, but God does require mercy. So we're going to sell the possessions of the church, ransom 7,000 men, free them, give them provisions, send them back to Persia. And reportedly, what happened was, the word spread all the way up to the king. And you can imagine 7,000 guys telling this story in Persia would have quite the impact in the culture. Now, here's where things historically get a little uncertain. There is a tradition that says that this was the turning point, that this is the act that ended the war. We know that Acacius met with Bahram V following this act of generosity. Some say that it was, even if the only issue here is that there's a little timeline issue where did Acacius go to meet Bahram before or after the war ended? Some say before the war ended, and this is what shifted the tides. Some say a little after the war, but helped in time to negotiate the peace treaty. One of the only serious historical works on this was done by a scholar, Louis Sacco. He did a dissertation at the Sorbonne on this topic. And he says that this meeting is what secured the peace treaty, and then which reestablished the religious freedom for Christians in the Persian Empire. And then Edward Gibbons of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire fame said, quote, "I wish to persuade myself that Acacius persuaded to the restoration of peace." And I too wish to persuade myself of this. It would be a great story if Acacius had won the peace. Although my sense is that the actual historical timeline here does not support that. It seems that he went shortly after the peace treaty was proclaimed. Now, there are some who point to the Shahnameh, in particular Louis Sacco again. So the Shahnameh is this great Persian epic, and says, there's a story in the Shahnameh that there's this Byzantine diplomat who came to Bahram and endeared himself and then led to the peace treaty. So that's some evidence. But I think, other texts suggest that Acacius went afterwards. But whether or not he came, right before or right after the treaty, it still is the case that peace isn't won the moment that treaties are signed. In fact, peace is fragile and could, always disappear at any moment. After a treaty is signed, you're going to need lots of people to continue to work for it. And having a endeared Roman bishop in the court of the Persian emperor is going to be useful nonetheless. And having 7,000 men recounting the tale of the mercy of the Romans throughout Persian society is going to help. So I think we can be confident that Acacius did lead up to his, live up to Maruthus's memory here. One last story about this war. So this, I talked you through to the end of the war here. 100 years later, during the 502 to 506 Roman-Persian War, so, peace lasted for about 80 years and then broke out again in 502. Kavad I was the ruler of Persia, and he marched his army to the city of Naperket. And in response, he was going to invade, this was a Roman city. In response to this, the local inhabitants gathered themselves peacefully and went out to meet the king, Kavad, and brought him a golden cup. And they gave him this golden cup, and they said, this was the cup given by Yazdegerd to Saint Maruthus. And reportedly, upon seeing this, Kavad, quote, wept and said, far be it from me to take the memorial of my fathers, or to do evil to this city. But let there be friendship and peace between me and the city all the days of my life. And he returned in peace to his own land, and the city and the whole land were delivered. Now, there are some historical questions about the accuracy of this. In particular, this is from a life of a saint, and this misidentifies one of the Persian kings. It refers to someone who was actually, the person in question was the grandfather. So one might wonder if this actually happened. But nonetheless, it's a nice story, right? That the Persian king goes a marching to take over a city, and the people simply meet him with a golden chalice, just as Acacius once, sold the golden chalices to free the Persians, and said, "Here, have this. This is from your ancestor Yazdegerd to us." And he saw it and turned around and went home. So, what can we learn from all of this? Well, a lot of lessons to be learned. What I love about these stories is it has a lot of saints in it, and the saints play very different roles. You have Saint Shimon, who led nonviolent war resistance. You had Saint Maruthus and Saint Acacius, who didn't resist, but actively built peace, built bridges. You had Saint Abdus, the holy martyr, who committed terrorist acts. You had Saint Pulcheria, a political and religious figure who encouraged the embracing of a kind of religious ideology, a religious politics that led to a war. These are characters that we can all recognize in our own times. And I think in our own times, the martyrs and terrorists and religious political figures get a lot more attention than the peacemakers do. And one lesson we can take from this is that we should play up the peacemakers. And I think this is, now one thing to note is there are a couple of times in describing the story where I've said, it appears this great peacemaking story, Acacius freeing these people, leading the peace, or, Kavad seeing this and ending that war. And that I've raised historical questions about, where the lives of the saints seem to overplay the peacemaking element of it. In particular, I mentioned Louis Sacco, who did this in his dissertation. And I think Sacco got the history wrong. So is that in tension with what I just said about playing up the peacemaking element of it? Well, I don't think so. Because Louis Sacco has his reasons for trying to play up the peacemaking element of it. In particular, because while his academic name is Dr. Louis Sacco, he has 2 doctorates, actually. He's better known as his beatitude Mar Louis Raphael, patriarch of the Chaldean Catholic Church. He is the leader of the Syriac Church in this area. And he came to do a dissertation on the subject. He did his first dissertation in the 70s at the Pontifical Institute in Rome, and then wanted to teach religious history in Iraq, where he lived. But Saddam Hussein said, "You're not allowed to teach Christianity." So he said, "Fine, I'll go to the Sorbonne and do a history of the Roman war, and that'll be my other dissertation, and then you'll let me teach that." So he does the history of Acacius and Maruthus. And this is, the main scholarly work on the subject. And I don't want to fault his beatitude for saying that bishops living in the Middle East can have a role to play in peace, given that he is a bishop living in the Middle East. And given that he himself likes to engage in these peace efforts. In 2009, at the beginning of Ramadan, he went out and wrote an appeal for national peace, a reconciliation to end violence, and he co-signed it with a bunch of other religious leaders. He said, quote, "This is a gesture of closeness to our Muslim brothers. We are all brothers, sons of the same God. We must respect and cooperate the good people of our country. Iraq needs reconciliation and dialogue." He went on a year later to win Pax Christi International's Peace Award. I think it's a beautiful thing that there are today in the Middle East inheritors of this, people like Sacco who still tell the story of Maruthus and Acacius and their gambit for peace. And inspired by this, themselves are still trying to do this. I'm sure that Sacco, will mention these stories when he preaches, and that, is partly inspiring him and doing what he does. So here's my conclusions. And then I want to hear from all of you because I've been joining on for a while. There are two lessons that I take from listening to the story. One is that saints are complicated people. I wish I could tell you a story about the saints where they're all peacemakers, where none of them burned down a Zoroastrian temple, where none of them oversaw a war. But saints are messy. And the second is that history, remembering the saints, is also a messy thing. We can sometimes get it wrong, sometimes in our fervor for peace, play things up, and sometimes in the other way too. We can say that Abdus is a martyr and someone to be admired, emulated here. And we have examples of that. We can imagine that Martyropolis would itself have been controversial. Here's all our people that we love that were killed by others. So are these two bad things then? The messiness of saints in their actuality and the danger of historical memory? Well, what I want to suggest is no, that this is not necessarily a bad thing. It does have its dangers, but on the one hand, all of us today are messy people. And there are parts of Abdus in all of us. And hopefully there are parts of Acacius and Maruthus in all of us. And if they can live their lives and become saints, then maybe there's some hope for us. And I wish, if I had more time, I would like to talk more about Pulcheria, because she went on to do wonderful things too, oversaw 2 ecumenical councils, for example. And Abdus and Pulcheria aren't remembered in the hagiographies for their role in the conflict. They're remembered for other things. But we also have Maruthus and Acacius who are remembered positively. And so I think on the subject of historical memory, what I would say is the most important thing with the saints is less what the details of their lives are, because, again, these stories get told and retold, so many questions, but more what we do with them. And we can build monuments to, okay, here's this Greek that was killed by a Turk, and that's why we hate the Turks. Or we can say, here's a cup that was given to Maruthas by Yazdegerd, and that's why we should make peace with you, Kabad. Or here's two bishops who made peace centuries ago in this realm, and that's why, Patriarch Sako wants to make peace again as a bishop in Iraq today.